Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. In this video, we're going to look at several innovative ideas introduced in the Battle for Greece campaign-only DLC, which I think warrant consideration or at least discussion about bringing into regular AoE2. There were many ideas the devs played around with in that DLC, and while I don't think all of them would make sense to bring into the mainstream and especially multiplayer, 4 in particular jumped out to me. So we're going to talk about those and why I think they especially have potential. The first change, which I expect to be the least controversial, is I like how the DLC handled the Barracks, replacing the two-handed swordsman and champion with a single unit, and I think a similar thing should happen for every civilization. What they did in the DLC was pretty clever. They broke up those 2 units into a unit upgrade called the Paragon and a new technology called Battle Drills. The first 3 units in the swordsman line are all the exact same, but instead of a new skin for two-handed swordsman, you pick up the tech Battle Drills, which is literally the two-handed swordsman upgrade. You get the exact same change to the swordsman line for the exact same cost, just without a visual change. The Paragon upgrade was then just straight up the champion upgrade for the usual cost and stat increase. On the surface, it may appear like you end up with the same final result, with maybe a slightly less intuitive look, but this really brings a few major advantages over the current system. The first is the champion is kind of a silly unit, and this would let us get rid of it. The name doesn't make any sense, as champion literally means someone who's the best at something, or in dueling, someone who stands in for someone else, and having armies of champions is just odd on the face of it. Also, let's be real for a second, the two-handed swordsman looks way cooler, that's just a fact. The yellow shoulder pads really pop. It can only be through massive brainwashing and conditioning that anyone would accept the champion as a visual upgrade, and this would let us squeeze that unit out to be replaced by the two-handed swordsman skin and name. Basically, the current champion upgrade would be called the two-handed swordsman upgrade, and the current two-handed swordsman upgrade becomes the distinct tech Battle Drills. There's no reason the existing champion sprite then couldn't be turned into a regional skin for a particular civilization, similar to the Savar or Legionary, and would look great with Teutons as they're more heavily armored, but that's a separate discussion. If you're not sold by these less serious arguments, I still think there's 2 compelling arguments from a game design perspective that this change addresses. The first is upgrade time. The champion line has always been an annoyingly long process to tech into, especially if you're teching all the way from militia in the late game, having to do 4 successive upgrades in series without even having the ability to queue them all up. By breaking things into a tech and unit upgrade in Imperial, you can have both be done concurrently at different barracks, potentially dropping that tech switch time from 3:45 to 2:45. Going from Spearman to Halberdier, in contrast, is 1 minute 25 seconds, and Eagle Scout to Elite Eagle Warrior is 1 minute 40. So the tech switch into Swordsman has always been an outlier, though admittedly they could just shorten the research time to address this more simply. The other argument in favor of the overhaul is that it gives the devs more control over how good they want a civilization's militia line to be. Yes, they can already play around with access to militia armor techs and supplies, but for many civilizations, the strength of their champion line just comes down to whether they get the champion or not. With the alternative system of Battle Drills though, they have a second lever to pull. So they could give you the direct unit upgrade and the equivalent of the champion upgrade now, but not the relatively cheap Battle Drills tech with its +3 attack, and becomes just one more balanced tool and way to make the barracks feel different between civilizations. Now, while I'm in favor of this idea, I don't want to strawman the counter arguments, and I think they're worth considering. So let's touch on some of those that I suspect come to mind. First, this is a slight buff to the champion line, letting you tech into them faster. I don't feel like the perception is the existing time investment is anything other than an annoyance, but it is admittedly a balanced change. Another concern might be that looking at the unit would then give you even less information than it does now, and clicking on them to check their stats would be even more important, as a longsword could be anything from completely unupgraded to a fully upgraded Bulgarian militia line with big gains. My response to that concern is that's already the case with blacksmith upgrades and unique techs, which don't show up visually, and that doesn't seem to be a huge problem. Likewise, elite upgrades for unique units don't visually change them, and while it would probably be better if they did, it's obviously something that we as a fanbase are able to handle, with this being no more extreme than other existing examples. All in all, it just feels like the pros outweigh the cons on this one, though I'd also understand an argument to just leave the champion line as it is. Moving on, the second DLC idea I like is some elements, but not all, of the water overhaul. The DLC essentially adds 3 new ship lines and splits the game's base dock into 2 different buildings. Obviously, water maps are generally unpopular for maybe a few reasons, and I think a lot of people would agree with the premise that water could be improved, though we probably won't agree on all the details of how to do that. My favorite naval ideas to come out of the DLC are the ram ship and the split into 2 distinct naval buildings. First, for the ram ship, this would be in addition to the galley, fire, and demo lines, but act as a counter to fire ships while being weak to galleys in the early game. Currently, when docks are close together, fire galleys largely dominate early aggression on water, and this might encourage a more interesting dynamic with water openings. Considering mass galley then eventually trumps fire galleys in practice, they could actually make fire galleys and ships a bit more resistant against arrows, as there would be a true counter with ram ships, making it all feel a bit less snowbally, which is one common critique of the current water design. It wouldn't even be necessary for ram ships to upgrade in Castle Age, and could just be a way to spice up Feudal Age a bit, with the unit then becoming more obsolete in the late game. The other change I like is splitting the dock into two, as done in the DLC, giving you the economically focused dock that makes fishing ships, trade, and transports, while the other building would be the shipyard, producing your warships. I like this idea in the DLC because it creates an interesting trade-off when going on water, either on pure water maps or hybrid maps, about how much to invest in your economy versus military infrastructure. I admit the water overhaul as I'm suggesting it is the most expansive change in this list, but I also think water is arguably the aspect of the game which has the most potential from a well thought out redesign. Now my next suggestion is going to sound out there at first, but I've done some preemptive testing to put it into perspective, so keep an open mind, and is based on the idea that the new hoplite unit in the DLC has 0.3 range, whereas most melee units have 0. Having seen that in action, I think this would be an interesting idea to consider bringing to the spear line. Now, I know the reaction to this is that it's insane, with the Kamiuk or Step Lancer coming to mind. Here, with basically balanced resources, the elite Kamiuks crush champions, despite having way worse attack and a numbers disadvantage, because +1 range lets them double up in their engagement and basically removes pathfinding issues. One champion may beat one elite Kamiuk, but in mass that completely reverses. Here's the thing though, Battle for Greece showed you don't have to jump to the full +1 range, and by choosing a smaller range increase, you can find a point where the units have a bit of reach without being able to fully double up their ranks. And I played around with a bit of modding to show you what this could look like. First, if we just take a standard group of halberdiers and champions with equal total resources and mash them into each other with the current 0 range for each, champions come out with 70 to 80% of their HP left. The current state is not only are you rewarded for having a unit with a gold component to its cost, but the losses they take with the champion in this case are actually sustainable as long as you could sell 100 food or wood for 10 or more gold at the market, which is always the case. So this is usually a very safe trade for champions, and we'd want to keep that dynamic. If we gave the halberdiers the full Kamiuk treatment with +1 range, the champion's losses nearly double, and now with guilds, this is only barely sustainable for the champions to do by selling food. Clearly, it makes the spear line too good against mass infantry, and if we then swap these out with Japanese halberdiers with +1 range, the halberdiers are engaging way too efficiently to make this sustainable for the champions by selling food, and completely changes the dynamic. Previously, this would have killed the discussion right here, but that's where the fraction of a range can come in. For example, giving generic halberdiers a smaller bump to just 0.3 range, it looks a little more natural when they're fighting, looking like they're attacking the enemy instead of just punching them while holding a weapon. This says 0 range, and not orange by the way. It turns out that extra range also has surprisingly little impact on the results as well. The champions against 0 range halberdiers had 70 to 80% of their HP left over, and against 0.3 range halberdiers with a generic civ, I got results only a few percentages below that, so it wasn't enough in this case to lead to a dramatically different outcome. If we jump to 0.5 tiles of range, of course, the champions drop further, and is starting to get to the point that it's a borderline balanced value trade with bottomed out market prices without guilds. From this alone, I think 0.5 tiles would be impacting things too much. As another example, against an equal number of knights, pikemen with the current 0 range only roughly half beat the knights, remembering that knights are much more expensive on an individual basis. The full +1 range is then clearly ridiculous, with the pikemen's current stats turning into a total landslide. On the other hand, the suggested 0.3 range simply turns into a more narrow victory for the knights, but not a completely different outcome with balanced numbers, and I personally wouldn't advocate for anything more than 0.3 after doing some testing. What this would all do is introduce two nice changes. The first is the range would make them visually more interesting and make more logical sense. A spearman should have some reach, as that's kind of the whole point of a spear, no pun intended. The other is mass spear units would start to behave fundamentally differently than individual spearline units, which again is exactly how spears should work if we use history as an example. Remember, nearly all archer and cavalry archer variants, as well as skirmishers, have a bonus directly against spear units, and the scorpion could easily be given a bonus here as well, with scorpions getting a bit of love lately from the devs. The point is, whether you like the idea or not, there are ways to keep mass spear in check, and the bigger concern to me would be that patrol stacking becomes too good, hit and run micro might get too exploitable, or mass spear against cavalry civs could get out of hand. We'd have to see how it all plays out, but I feel like there's potential in the idea. And if the devs are looking to push infantry and by extension archer civs a little more, the point is you can tweak the spearline range without going full on Kamiuk. As for the fourth DLC idea I like, we'll go a bit closer to home for me on this one. And what if we bring the Immortals switching between melee and range mode to the Japanese, notably the Samurai? Now, I'm not as sold on this one, and I mostly bring this up because the legend Sandy Peterson himself in an interview once said they had considered giving the Samurai the option to swap attacks, as well as the Cataphract, but ended up deciding not to. Partly, I suspect they chose not to because they were on a deadline to release the game, and new mechanics take time to implement, but they also worried about players leaving units on the wrong mode, attacking a trebuchet with arrows as one example. With the Wrath accepted into the game at this point though, and now the Achaemenid Immortal having the mechanic, let's just bring it home and add it to the Samurai, which always kind of struggled to do something different than the regular champion line and justify its castle creation. On the flip side, Japanese have good archers already, and there's a lot of decisions to make in implementing this, namely do they still have their anti-unique unit bonus when ranged, which might be overpowered, and whether or not they take anti-archer bonus damage from skirmishers, even in melee mode, which the Immortals do. I do think the argument about accidentally attacking trebuchets in ranged mode is one that's pretty easily fixed. Say for example, if you hold Alt while telling units to attack, they only attack in melee. And that feels like the kind of feature that could make sense with now 2, and I'd argue a third candidate for the multiple attack mechanic. The flip side is this might actually just nerf the unit by giving them a weakness to skirmishers, and there's no reason every idea the original devs left on the table have to be eventually included. Plus, maybe I'm a little biased here, trying to spruce up Japanese as my go-to free-for-all civ. Now between all these ideas put out there, there's still a few aspects of the DLC that I would be much more hesitant to bring over. First off, the large emphasis on aura effects, between the Polemarch, hoplites pumping each other up, the Strategos, and Achaemenid Town Center auras. While I think they work in a campaign, in multiplayer I think aura effects should and will be used much more sparingly. It's the same thing with the double unique techs at Castle and Imperial Age. And while that's great for the new civs, I think it would be chaos if they tried to add 90 unique techs to the game, trying to balance them, and then come up with interesting ideas. And finally, not included in the DLC, but an idea I'm 100% down for the devs to experiment with, is wonders having global effects for players who build them, as something meaningful to break up late game stalemates. Maybe building a wonder in a conquest victory game sends you from Imperial Age to a Golden Age, with some sort of global benefit to your economy, plus 10% pop cap, or military bonus like plus 5% attack rate across the board. There are really a lot of ways to do it. The bonuses don't even have to be civilization specific, as much as I love adding a wonder effect section to each overview, but would just have to be something to justify investing the 1000 stone, gold, and villager work time outside of wonder victories, which I think would be a fun spin on the late game. Admittedly, most games would end before wonders come in, and how exactly multiple wonders for one player would work, and if the benefits would be diluted across an entire team, are questions it might take a bit of trial and error for the devs to work out, but I still like the potential. So those are just some ideas I've been liking the sound of lately, and I'm curious if any of them resonated for you guys, especially those of you who played through at least some of the Battle for Greece campaign and personally experienced the mechanics I brought up. Big thanks to James, Jared2142, Justin, Samantha, Shawarma Ryder, Steven, Woodruff, and everyone else on Patreon for their amazing ongoing support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.